Let's welcome in Dan Perry. He is former Europe, Africa, and Middle East editor for the Associated Press. He joins us now live from Tel Aviv. Wonderful to have you. We'll dive right in. Israel's Minister of Strategic Affairs, I know you know, met with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan just last night. So a source tells us they discussed transitioning to a different phase of the war. What more do you know about those talks?
The U.S. wants Israel to be more surgical and to, at the same time, move faster towards the goal because it is untenable in terms of public opinion, I think, for President Biden, and not only for this to continue much longer at the pace of civilian casualties that we've seen. Israel, of course, has been arguing in attempts to persuade the Americans that it's doing all it can to minimize the civilian casualties, but the numbers are large. And the political fallout is considerable. And I think that is fundamentally the shift that we're going to see into probably blunt force for the next week or two. But after that, a U.S. encouraged a transition to a more surgical phase that can sustain a prolonged war. Because at the same time, Israeli officials are all saying that that this will take many months longer to achieve anything resembling their ultimate aim, which is removing Hamas from power in Gaza, or, and this they don't say, a potential fallback position of degrading them to the point where it's tolerable for Israel to pull out.
So I do want to dig deeper into that in just a moment. But another very passionate stance so many hold, as you know, is these efforts to bring the hostages home. We know President Joe Biden spoke with Qatar's leader on Tuesday. Where do those negotiations stand right now?
They're going on all the time, but there are two different versions of Hamas. The political leadership of Hamas, which basically is living in exile in Qatar and some luxury also, I may add, is what passes for more moderate. And they're more interested in finding a way out of this and bringing about a situation where Hamas can be part of the joint political leadership with a moderate Fatah movement currently based in the West Bank. At the same time, the so-called military leadership of Hamas, run by Yahya Sinwar in the Gaza Strip, is presenting a very maximalist position. Now, I would caution anyone from believing anything said by people who are actively involved in a fight, and a rather desperate one at that. So who knows if Sinwar is going to fold eventually? Israel is banking on that when the pressure becomes large enough, Sinwar will, in the end, hand over the hostages and try to negotiate for himself some kind of deal, maybe free pass to join his friends in Qatar. But there is no evidence yet in public. And I cannot tell you I'm speaking to Sinwar personally, so I don't really know much more than anyone else does about Sinwar's actual, ultimate negotiating position. But it would appear like he's holding out for now, and it's basically a game of chicken. Israel is banking that he'll eventually break during their window of legitimacy, which I think is another month or maybe a bit more of prosecuting the war the way they have been. And Sinwar is hoping that the world pressure will force Israel to fold while he's still standing and holding hostages. And at that point, it becomes a prolonged standoff with Sinwar undoubtedly presenting maximalist demands for what he gets in return for the hostage.
As time is ticking for the hostages and their families. So Israeli Prime Minister, this was interesting. He wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal Monday outlining his 3 prerequisites for peace: destroy Hamas, demilitarize Gaza, de-radicalize the whole of Palestinian society. There was no mention, Dan, of releasing the hostages. Why do you believe that wasn't included there?
Well, it could be a rare case of transparency from Netanyahu, because his policy has not prioritized the release of the hostages, and he's taking a lot of heat in Israeli society for that. I cannot tell you what he was thinking, but in Israel, if you had a referendum today, do you prioritize the hostages and maybe take on Sinwar the day after, maybe 3 months from now, versus continuing the war and perhaps sacrificing the hostages? The former would win hands down. So Netanyahu generally is very tuned to public opinion. I don't know why he's not reflecting that in his current position. But I found something else interesting in his op-ed you mentioned, which is that he did not expressly say that the Palestinian Authority cannot be the force in charge of Gaza under those conditions the day after. And until now, he had been saying that, which embroiled him in a head-on clash, basically, with President Biden, whose position it is that the Palestinian Authority should be in charge the day after. So maybe, just maybe, there's a glimmer of hope in that omission.
All right, we shall see. How forthcoming do you believe Israel is being with the families who've been putting more pressure on the prime minister now to bring their loved ones home?
Frankly, not very. The families are very unhappy, and they've been making their unhappiness quite public in Israel. There's a lot of politics involved, and for the longest time, the prime minister was not willing to meet with the families at their request. And at some point in a major discussion of their situation in the Knesset, they were kept out of the meeting. So there's a lot of tension between the hostage families, who by and large want the war to move to a different phase where their loved ones, their fate is a priority, and the government, which is not making that the priority. That is the inescapable conclusion. And so I don't know if they're being forthright or not, but they're certainly not doing the bidding of the families. That's clear.
So in terms of the U.S.'s request for Israel to get in there and be a little bit more surgical with some of their offensives, now that it's expanded into these urban refugee camps in central Gaza, what is Israel doing to minimize these civilian casualties?
They have been arguing for 2 months that they're doing everything they can and that there's nothing else they can do. They have not messaged that anything is going to be different right now, except if anything, that the fighting will be even bloodier, and who knows exactly what the level of civilian casualties will be. When they killed 3 of their own hostages a couple of weeks ago, it kind of looked like a light trigger finger, because they were shirtless, carrying a white flag and shouting help in Hebrew, and still they were shot. Some will argue that suggests there is a light trigger finger, and maybe that can be adjusted. But by and large, I have some sympathy to Israel's claim that Hamas uses human shields and operates from schools and mosques and UNRWA, UN facilities and hospitals. All that is actually true. A degree of cynicism that is almost breathtaking on the part of the Hamas. I have to think that their main strategy for minimizing civilian hostages is compelling the population to move around. And again, in recent days, they've issued orders for the population, or at least recommendations, for the population to move out of Nuseirat and other areas in central Gaza. And of course, when you do that, you expose yourself to charges that it's ethnic cleansing and you'll never let them back. And so Israel's in a bit of a bind and a win, or rather a lose-lose situation, almost no matter what it does. But I certainly hope, as I think everyone does, that they find a way to do the right thing, which is, I do think, to degrade Hamas, while moving to a more tactically precise manner that causes the pace of these civilian casualties, indeed any civilian casualties, to cease.
And another aspect to consider also is, as these civilians are moving around, do they have what they need to survive? We know Israel will no longer automatically grant visas to United Nations workers. How do you see that impacting aid efforts into Gaza now?
The aid situation is a complex matter, because Israel fears that any aid that goes in will simply go straight to the Hamasniks in their tunnels, and the history of what has happened to aid destined or intended for civilians in Gaza is precisely that. Think about it. Gaza has received more aid from international players and from the Arab world, and indeed from Israel itself, in the form of energy and other supplies than any Arab country, I think, in the past decade or two. And what they did with it is build tunnels, Hamas did, and very sophisticated rockets and other military means, and the people are largely impoverished. So Israel's concern about letting in humanitarian aid is not purely out of cruelty or indifference, but I think reflective of a genuine problem. Now, on top of that, there is a lot of unhappiness in Israel with the role of the UN, basically UNRWA, the UN Relief Works Administration, which theoretically is there to help refugees, but in reality, or at least Israel claims, and I think those claims have some credibility, has become very much complicit with Hamas, and even a case of some facilities that have been found to have been used for storage of weapons, I think probably is reflective of a really big problem. And on top of that, Israelis are unhappy with the Red Cross, that can credibly say, look, we work discreetly and Hamas just hasn't given us any access. But again, from Israel's perspective, have not really tried to create pressure on Hamas via players that might be able to create that pressure or to pass on that pressure, like Qatar, like some of the Arab countries, to relent. So you're looking here at a situation where there may still be infants, and there are elderly people well into their 80s who are being held, and sick people, even dying people who are being held in terrible conditions by captors who released hostages of accused of rape in the case of women. And the Red Cross is not being allowed to see them. Now, is the Red Cross making maximal noise about this? If they are, I haven't heard it. So, I mean, a lot of these Israeli complaints about international bodies probably need to be looked at pretty closely.
Wow. Well, it is fascinating inside. Dan Perry, thank you for joining us.